Hello, my name's Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK hobby, imports and distributors, and welcome to episode 3, Stalin's Purges and the 5-year plans up to the German invasion of 1941. Not long after coming to power, the Bolsheviks started to have purges of its ranks, and the first major one was 1921, when they got rid of some 200,000 from the Communist Party, basically asked them to leave, not generally bloody. But by the late 20s, Joseph Stalin had a grip on power and used a series of purges to take out any opposition, and these were somewhat bloodier. The 1928 purge of political opponents, Trotskyites, Red Army leadership, Kulites, wealthy peasants, religious activists and others enemy of the states. Once this was completed and his power was total, Stalin embarked on a series of plans to modernise the Soviet Union. Stalin stated, "The Soviet Union is almost 100 years behind the most modern Western countries. And if this is not completed in 10 to 15 years, we will be crushed." These were called the 5-year plans. And in fact, the Soviet Union continued these plans from 1986 to 1990 with the 5th plan. In 1929, the economic crash in the West played right into the hands of the Soviet Union, with kind of predicted by their Congress of 1927. And how they could take advantage of the economic nosedive by the West. So, after the purges, Stalin set about the first of his 5-year plans, from 1928 to 1932. So if there was to be more folks living in the cities and working in factories, they will need feeding. So the radicalisation of farming from almost subsistence to mass collective farms, producing vast amounts of food, but with less workers and more modern farm machinery. This worked, and food was fairly plentiful in the cities, but agricultural workers paid a terrible price. There were uprisings amongst farmers and workers who could only keep a small amount of food over the strict quotas. But Stalin was no Lenin, and he basically got rid of them. And millions more starved, maybe 7 to 8 million. See the picture behind me of these young kids who are starving to death, it's awful. In the cities, new factories were built, mainly heavy industry. Iron, steel, electric production were massively boosted, as this would lead to later further industrial development. By the mid-1930s, the USSR went from way down the league of industrial nations to number 2 behind the USA, but it was carried at great price, millions dead, and much of what was produced was substandard to Western production. To Stalin, he did not care what it cost in humanity. And in the second plan, 33 to 1937, the party introduced workers' incentive as well as workers' punishments. And he concentrated on building of infrastructure, such as better railways, communications, plus further priority in every industry. In farming, there were fewer and fewer independent farms, and most peasants were working on massive collective farms, but were given a small plot of the land to use for their own. One of the other things in this second plan was the closing down of all houses of worship, with the plan of getting rid of the clergy by 1936. The second plan, not successful as the first plan, and the third from 38 to 43, was at last to look at consumer goods, but was put over to weapons and armaments. Ideologically, the Nazis and the Soviets were miles apart. Hitler looked on the Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, under people, and looked to the east for Lebensraum or living space. The Soviets thought the Nazi Germany a potential threat. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Germany was restricted from development of certain weapons such as tanks and combat aircraft under the Versailles Treaty. So it entered an agreement with the Soviet Union for testing facilities in their country. The two countries, as early as 1922, signed the Treaty of Rapallo, and the Weimar Germany became the Soviet Union's main trading and diplomatic partner. They also made plans for splitting Poland right down the middle before Germany was admitted to the League of Nations in 1924. So poor old Poland was cooked many years before. The testing of weapons included tanks, aircraft, chemical weapons, and even rocketry. Behind me is a rare picture of the German fighter aircraft at Lipsek, the fighter school in the Soviet Union, and Soviet and German tankers in training. There was a lot of cooperation, especially in chemical warfare. In fact, the Germans were actually managing the Soviet program. The Kalmar Tank School held regular courses from 1928 to 1933 with joint training of drivers from both the Red Army and the German Army. With the coming to power of Hitler, there was a cooling of this testing, and the Kalmar Tank School was disbanded with the German Army, last courses going through in 1933. As the Treaty of Versailles were basically ripped up, Nazi Germany were now openly developing heavy weapons. During the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, German and Soviet weapons and advisors clashed in combat, especially in the air. The Germans were on the nationalist side and the Soviets on the Republican side. So it came as a complete shock to the world when in 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had an alliance in the form of a 10-year non-aggression pact. In fact, after the 1938 Munich Agreement, Stalin thought the West were trying to turn Hitler to the east and to avoid war. So on the 23rd of August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, or officially the Treaty of Non-Aggression, that secretly gave Eastern Poland, Romania, Finland, Estonia and Latvia under Soviet influence. The start of World War II was now only weeks away. We shall now look at Stalin's military purges about 1937 to 38. So after about 18 months before the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, Stalin carried out his most devastating purges of his own military when he purged 35,000 senior Red Army leaders, including execution and imprisonment of some of the most capable and senior Red Army officers. This was under the official justification of a fascist plot, but more likely Stalin's paranoia about power grabs from within the military. There was also part of a greater purge called the Great Terror, in which maybe 1 million were put to death by the NKVD secret police. In 1938 though, Stalin ended the purges and then blamed the NKVD for overzealousness and wiped out half of them as well, for good measure. In late 1940, the Soviet Union invaded Finland in the Winter War, but the purges of the Red Army leadership left the Red Army in poor state. As far as fighting went, the Soviet would eventually win, but at massive cost. Soldier to soldier, the Finnish troops were better quality in almost every area, and the Germans, well, they were noting this. On the 1st September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland at the start of World War II, and soon vast amounts of Nazi soldiers would come across the border into Poland. The Polish army fought bravely and cost the Germans many casualties. It was not the walkover many people think. 66 German divisions with 9,000 guns, 2,700 tanks, 2,300 aircraft against the Polish 39 divisions, 200 tanks, 700 tankettes and about 800 aircraft. The fighting lasted for over a month and the Polish forces were holding their own, but were soon about to be stabbed in the back massively. On the 17th of September 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east with 33 divisions, 6,000 guns, 5,000 tanks and 3,300 aircraft. For all the bravery of the Polish forces, they could no longer hold, and by the 6th of October it was over. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union carved up Poland. Stalin could sit there fat, dumb and happy and have a few vodkas and watch Nazi Germany screw over the Western Europe, which they nearly did, apart from one tiny detail. Us plucky Brits stopping the Nazi so-and-sos at the Battle of Britain. Defeat of the Nazis in the Battle of Britain may have speeded up the invasion that Hitler really was looking forward to, the invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 in Operation Barbarossa. Stalin's purges in the late 30s left the Red Army weak in leadership, and many of its weapons produced in the 5-year plans were basically rubbish, apart from a couple of tanks, the T-34 and KV-1. It does not matter if the tanks are great if the troops who are operating them are poorly trained and poorly led. On Sunday, the 22nd of June 1941, the world's largest land invasion started with almost 3.8 million German troops, nearly 4,000 tanks, 20,000 guns, close to 5,000 aircraft, plus 600,000 horses for good measure. The campaign under Operation Barbarossa would last until December 41, when it failed in the front of Moscow and Leningrad, cost the Germans almost 1 million casualties and freezing their Nazi arses off. Stalin's Soviet Union would lose close to 5 million casualties, 10,000 tanks and 10,000 aircraft. This would be the start of the most brutal conflict in history. In the end, Stalin had to turn to the decadent West for help, and the West sent them thousands of tanks, aircraft and trucks to equip the Red Army. In episode 4, we shall jump forward to the summer of 1944 and a very, very different Red Army. Better trained, better equipped, and with much better leadership, such as Marshal Zhukov, possibly the greatest general of World War II. But like all German and Soviet generals, he cared little about the troops' lives. Zhukov survived the Great Purge as his unit was fighting the Japanese in operations in 1938-39 near Manchuria.